In this, the third lesson of the Henry George School of Social Science course, Understanding Our Political Economy, we will now examine how the total wealth we produce is apportioned as a return to each of the three distinct factors of production. Henry George brought his analytical skills to the challenge of explaining the processes by which wealth is produced and then distributed back to the factors of production: rent to land, wages to labor, and interest or capital yield to capital goods. These processes were, he concluded, governed by natural laws of tendency that flow from consistent human behavior. How rent arose in communities and societies was a question addressed by the earliest political economists. A great deal of credit is given to the English writer David Ricardo for applying scientific analysis to the determination of the rent of land. Ricardo concentrated his energies on the rent of agricultural land and came up with a scientific principle, a natural law, that explains how rent first appears and increases. Ricardo observed, after all the fertile land in the immediate neighborhood of the first settlers were cultivated, if capital and population increased, more food would be required, and it could only be procured from land not so advantageously situated. What Ricardo recognized and explained was how the loss of freely accessible, most desired locations translated into a claim of a portion of what could be produced on those locations. The claimable amount was given the term rent. He wrote, "Thus by bringing successively land of a worse quality or less favorably situated into cultivation, rent would rise on the land previously cultivated." Henry George extended Ricardo's analysis well beyond a treatment of agricultural land and applied it to locations in cities and towns, and to all that George came to describe by the phrase natural opportunities. The definition of rent Henry George came to is as follows. Rent is that portion of production or wealth claimed in return for access to land, when land of equal quality is no longer freely available. The amount of rent associated with any given location could be determined in a straightforward manner. George concluded, rent is determined by the margin of production. That is, rent equals the amount of produce in excess of what could be produced from the poorest land in use with the same amount of labor and capital. Note that Henry George's definition is descriptive. He will later in his analysis add moral judgments with regard to the distribution of rent to private individuals and entities rather than to the community or society as a whole. To add some context to the operation of the law of rent, let's examine what actually occurred in Philadelphia, the North American city founded early in the 17th century by William Penn, recipient of a significant grant of land by the King of England. Assume that at the time of founding, a bare subsistence existence required a minimum consumption of 60 units of wealth. A generation after the city was established, the same size land parcel, now used for commerce rather than agriculture, yielded 300 units of wealth, now acquired by direct production and by the exchange of goods and services. With this passage of time and a significant increase in population, there was no longer any land in the city that could be settled on for free. Let's look at this process using some simple graphs. Let's return again to the earliest stages of settlement. When all land initially was freely accessible, the best locations potentially yielded 100 units of wealth. The entire yield was wages, the return to labor, and interest, the return to capital goods, in some proportion determined by the productivity of labor and the quality of the capital goods available. When land yielding 100 units of wealth became fully occupied, the next best location, still freely accessible, yielded 90 units of wealth. Then the best locations could command rent of 10 units. Political economy describes the best freely accessible land as the margin of production. Looking into the future, when all land able to provide subsistence or greater is fully occupied, the best locations now have an advantage equal to 40 units of output. These 40 units are what constitutes the rent attached to these locations. Producers cannot afford to turn over more than 40 units of wealth as rent because 60 units is the minimum required for subsistence. Only when labor productivity increases by the introduction of new forms of capital goods and new technologies will rents continue their upward climb. There is another way to show these relationships that might make the impact clearer. Presented in a somewhat different way by using a circle graph, we see that before we learned to make and use tools, all wealth was produced by labor, and all wealth was returned to labor as wages. As people learned new technologies and developed more efficient tools, total wealth produced grew dramatically. So long as there were no permanent settlements, wealth was distributed to labor as wages and to capital goods as interest. At a time when people were largely self-sufficient, working on the land in agriculture and other crafts, this basic relationship was clear. The modern economy, in which most people are employed by business entities and paid a monetary wage, obscures the fact that labor may be producing greater wealth, that is wages, than the worker is receiving in monetary compensation. Settlement meant that eventually the best locations were taken, sometimes used, sometimes held idle. These locations command an increasing amount of rent as a claim on the total wealth produced. Over time, as population generates an increasing demand for land, wages tend to be driven down as even quite marginally productive land commands rent. Externalities abound to affect the quantity and quality of wealth produced by labor and capital goods. Natural disasters, for example, destroy enormous amounts of what we produce, yet the basic distribution of wealth is governed by fundamental relations. As Henry George explained, where land is free and labor is assisted by capital, wages will consist of the whole produce less what is necessary to induce the storing up of labor as capital. Where land is subject to ownership and rent arises, wages will be fixed by what labor could secure from the highest natural opportunities open to it without paying rent, that is, the margin of production. Where all natural opportunities are monopolized, wages may be forced by competition among laborers to the minimum at which they will consent to reproduce. These natural laws described by Henry George are, however, laws of tendency, influenced by a long list of what economists call externalities. The form of government, the system of law, and how government raises its revenue are at the top of this list. With a study of how wealth is distributed to each of the three factors of production, we are faced with a descriptive challenge. We must examine how the natural laws of distribution operate. At the same time, we look prescriptively at the outcomes and apply moral judgments regarding equity and fairness. Philosophically, the distinction is between questions of, quote, what is, and questions of, quote, what ought to be. What we know about the behavior of ancient groups is that they migrated as their sources of food diminished, as weather patterns changed, as internal disputes arose, as external threats appeared, or as signs from the gods directed them. People continued to move from one place to another for similar reasons today. Within virtually every society, there eventually emerged three distinct subgroups. Hunters became warrior protectors. Knowledge bearers developed into the priestcraft. Thirdly, those who produced the food and other goods required by all three subgroups for their survival. Over time, the majority were coerced into subservient status as serfs or peasants or slaves. Warrior protectors adopted their own rituals and means of leadership selection. Hereditary transfer of position emerged, sanctioned by the gods as communicated through the priestcraft. The end result was a hierarchy of power characterized by systems of aristocracy and monarchy, with the claimed divine right to rule. Consolidation of power over a population also meant control over territory and all that occurred within that territory. Borders needed to be protected, and the interests of those close to those who governed, nurtured, and supported. Regulation of trade and commerce to limit competition and reward loyal supporters became an ingrained responsibility and power of government. As wars were fought to consolidate minor fiefdoms into nation-states, writers on political economy tended to defend the idea that national strength required a closed economic system, that the nation must be as self-sufficient as possible, and that self-sufficiency required the establishment of colonies from which raw materials could be drawn and finished goods sold. Ideally, all goods had to be carried on ships owned by interests in the mother country. This closed economic system was referred to as mercantilism. In his criticism of mercantilism, Henry George wrote, "The truth is that merchants and manufacturers, are not the ultimate beneficiaries of the protective system, and that mercantile interests can long profit by it only when sheltered behind some special monopoly." This has been shown in the United States, where the owners of coal and mineral and timber and sugar land have constituted the backbone of the political strength that has carried protection to such monstrous length. After discarding the protectionist views he embraced as a young man, Henry George consistently championed free trade. However, real free trade meant, in his thinking, that government had the essential responsibility to secure and protect what he described as, quote, a fair field with no favors. With this regulatory environment established, the benefits to all of a healthy commerce would be realized. As he observed, while diversities of climate, soil, and geography at first separate mankind, they also act to encourage exchange. Commerce also promotes civilization. It is in itself a form of association or cooperation. Henry George also argued that there is a great harmony between free exchange of goods and political liberty, writing, "Modern civilization has gone so much higher than any before due to the great extension of association, not just in larger and denser communities, but in the increase of commerce and the numerous exchanges knitting each community together and linking them with others far apart, and also in the growth of international and municipal law, advances in security of property and person, strides in individual liberty, and movement towards democratic government. Our instinct is to cooperate, but within our nature is also an unfortunate tendency toward aggression that must be recognized and controlled, if not wholly prevented. What Henry George observed in his study of our behavior brought him to a fundamental generalization. Political economy proceeds from the following simple axiom: people seek to satisfy their desires with the least exertion. And in so doing, we exhibit a strong tendency to monopolize access to nature and resist competition. Our attitude toward the land is sadly expressed above. This part of the world is mine. I inherited the deed given to my family by the government after the indigenous people were massacred. Go steal your own land from someone else. I have weapons of mass destruction and will use them. The philosopher Mortimer Adler observed that in a society governed by just law, citizens would enjoy leisure, time to engage in civic affairs, and possess goods sufficient for a decent human existence. He wrote, "The size of a population directly affects the division of labor that is possible in a community, and indirectly its productivity of consumable wealth, the means of subsistence. But productivity is also affected by the technology available. A more populous community with a primitive technology may be less productive than a less populous community with an advanced technology. The productivity of a community determines the amount of wealth available to its members and the amount of human time that can be freed from toil or subsistence work." To the challenge put to us by Mortimer Adler, Henry George adds this: "The division of labor, when fairly established, benefits all by common pursuit. It is used instead of individuals attempting to satisfy all of their wants by directly resorting to nature on their own." Thus, because one of our natural inclinations is to behave monopolistically and use the force of law to create privileges for ourselves if we can, we must look deeply at how we are organized. Where there is widespread poverty, where there are periodic business depressions and prolonged periods of widespread unemployment, the one thing we can be certain of is that the distribution of wealth is not fairly established. Knowing this, the next challenge is to know what must be done. We have reached the end of Lesson 3.